and the first stop on our journey is the panel selection. And for this, I welcome Fabian Offert. Fabian Offert is assistant professor for the, well, rather young history and theory of the digital humanities. I'd say it's rather young, at the University of California in Santa Barbara. So he could be tanning at the beach right now, but instead he's here with us in wintry Aachen. That's something. And his research and teaching focuses on the visual digital humanities with a special interest in epistemology and aesthetics of computer vision and machine learning. And that is what he will give us some insight on today in his lecture on the concept of history in foundation models. It's in brackets, right?
Oh, that's why you need to whisper.
Yeah, I guess so.
That makes sense. All right, thank you so much for the nice introduction. Thank you so much for the invitation to Dominic and everybody else. It's great to be here. And indeed, I'm going to talk about the concept of history in foundation models today. And my talk is going to ask a specific question about a specific digital technology. And the question is, what concept of history emerges from large-scale contemporary artificial intelligence systems, which are also called foundation models? How do such systems conceptualize the past? What is the past for them? And just as a disclaimer at the beginning, right, this question does not imply any intentionality, agency, or subjectivity on the part of the machines that I look at. As recent scholarly interventions have shown very convincingly, there's no computer system today that could be reasonably called intelligent. And any technical object, I would argue, that exists in time and space has some primitive form of memory, right? So in a sense, a concept of history, a way that the past continues to exist for it with contingencies and omissions specific to its place in the world. So the question that I'm trying to ask is really utterly non-philosophical, it's non-speculative. And it could be rephrased, I think, as a different version that would go something like this. As far as can be shown, is there internal consistency to the outputs of a foundation model when it is tasked with processing inputs related to the past? And if so, what are the structuring principles of these internally consistent outputs, and how do they relate to the structuring principles humans apply to the past to render it into history? Now that's a mouthful, so let me first talk about history and then talk about foundation models. So in 1940, before fleeing France towards Spain and eventually taking his own life, Walter Benjamin wrote a short aphoristic text known in English as Thesis on the Philosophy of History, which is kind of not the right title or not the right translation of the title. So later translation use on the concept of history, which is the inspiration for my talk today. And in this text, Benjamin proposes a new and quite idiosyncratic materialist concept of history. And fundamentally for Benjamin, history is made, it's manufactured even. It's not something that we can discover, that we can find. To articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize it the way it really was. It means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. So in other words, history only comes into existence where the present is contested, right? Where the past is made relevant to the present. Or as Benjamin writes, history is the subject of a structure whose side is not homogeneous, empty time, but time filled by the presence of the now. And this presence of the now, or Jetztzeit, as Benjamin says in the original German, is not the present but something else, a moment of immediacy. And we can find the same moment of immediacy in Benjamin's other widely read text on the work of art in the age of its technological reproducibility from 1936. The political potential of film, then, so back then in the 1930s, a new and newly politicized medium, Benjamin argues, derives from its potential to produce abrupt cuts and shock the viewer into a different mode of thinking. In other words, the condition under which history becomes possible, the Augenblick der Gefahr, is the condition that film emulates. In both cases, awareness and insight depend on this moment of immediacy. And in both cases, the moment of immediacy must be actively captured and repurposed for a progressive, and for Benjamin that always means a progressive Marxist agenda, before it falls into the hands of the fascists. There is thus for Benjamin a relation between history as something more than just facts about the past world and the specific ways in which technology mediates our experience of the present world. Crucially, history manifests itself in technology, so film for Benjamin, not as a theme, but as a specific way of seeing. So in the framework of this line of thought, of Benjamin's thought, we could ask, what is the relation between history and technology today? What concept of history emerges from today's technology? And this is where we'll need to talk about foundation models. So foundation model is a term that was introduced by a collective of researchers at Stanford University in 2021. The paper is called On the Opportunities and Risks of Foundation Models. And basically what the term means is that the models are very large, A, and that they can be used for a variety of what the engineers call downstream tasks, right? So other things that you can do with the model. This is part B of this. For instance, just as an example, question answering and text summarization are usually considered distinctive problems in natural language processing. But GPT-3, you might be familiar with this kind of very large language model that was released by OpenAI in 2020, can do both, and it can do many other things. And in the visual domain, which is the domain that I'm most interested in, the recently released DALL-E 2 model has the capability to generate arbitrary photorealistic images from natural language prompts. And I assume we will hear much more about this in the talk after mine from Roland, but also in the other talks today. And just as an example, on the left here is the generation for the prompt, "Do you know why I stopped you today?" which is quite arbitrary. And DALL-E, unsurprisingly, is also very bad at generating an image that would correspond to the title, the concept of history, and it gives you this weird inspirational quote on the right here that spells "hitsy" hasty for some reason. Now, usually when people talk about the opportunities and risks, to quote the paper, of foundation models, they talk about either of these models, so GPT-3 or DALL-E 2, or Google's version of the same thing, Lambda and ImageGen, respectively. But I would like to talk first about a different model, which has received much less positive or negative press, but which I think has much more to say, in a way, about history than other models. And the model I would like to talk about is called CLIP, which is allegedly, if we I read the paper, allegedly short for Contrastive Language Image Pre-training. And it was released together with the first version of DALL-E back in 2021. This is also a model that came out of OpenAI, this big AI research corporation in California. CLIP is a so-called multimodal model, and what this means is that CLIP projects images and text into a common embedding space. So basically, CLIP learns from images in context. For instance, if you visit a website, right, every image on a website will have some text that contextualizes the image. It could be the image caption, it could be the alt text that makes the web page readable to people with visual impairments, or it could just be basically an article that surrounds the image and is related to the image, right? So this is the context that I mean. So a fully trained CLIP model consists of a high-dimensional vector space, or also embedding space, in which words and images that are related are close together. Similarity, in other words, is modeled as spatial proximity. And this is true for all embedding models, but for CLIP, the kind of like special aspect is that it's images and words, right? So both things in the same kind of space. It's a shared space. Importantly, this means that while CLIP was designed to do stuff like image labeling, it also facilitates what the computer scientists call image retrieval. So finding, selecting specific images within an unlabeled corpus of images based on visual or textual prompts. So you can give CLIP an image, right, and it will retrieve similar images from a corpus. Or you can give it a prompt, and it will look for images that correspond to this textual prompt. And this works because CLIP can be deployed on image data sets that have nothing to do with the training data, right? So these are separate data sets. There's the training data that OpenAI used to build this, but you can deploy it, you can use it on arbitrary corpora. So we can ask it for things, in a way, in terms of specific collections of images. So one part of my work is in the field of digital humanities. So the examples that I'm going to show you are from a system that we built called images.ai, that's imgs.ai, where we use CLIP to do image retrieval, so to basically find images in very large data sets, for instance, the whole collection of the MoMA or the Metropolitan Museum or the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, based on visual or textual prompts. For instance, here's the image that you get from the Metropolitan Museum collection if you search for the word algorithm. Now, obviously, in the Metropolitan Museum, there's no pictures of algorithms. What would that even be, right? But if you ask for that, if you ask CLIP for that, you get this glitch image, which obviously is just an error in the data set or in the database that the Metropolitan Museum has. But you can see why it would correspond to this query, right? Because it is a glitch image. It is kind of representative of computationalized aesthetics. Let me show you another example, and then you'll see where this is going, basically. So there's obviously also no Apple MacBooks in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum, and we can still ask CLIP to give us the visually closest thing to a MacBook in the collection, which, by the way, is about 350,000 images that we used in this project and that we extracted features from. And in this case, we get these images, and I think the most convincing one is maybe the one at the bottom row in the center, which is an ancient coin or medallion on what, in this case, we probably must call a space gray background, right? And you can see the similarity with the backside of a MacBook, and this is why we get these results right here. And let me show you one final example of these strange correspondences that I think is particularly interesting. So Diego Velázquez's 1656 painting, Las Meninas, is probably familiar to all of you, and it's one of the most analyzed paintings in art history, right? So W.J.T. Mitchell has a very interesting text on it. Michel Foucault famously spends the whole introduction of the Order of Things on Las Meninas, on talking about Las Meninas, and it's famous for its play on representation, right? Because there's images in the image, but it's only the reverse. There's people looking at people, people looking at images. The person who painted the painting is in the image. There's a whole, there's lots of gaze relations, so all kinds of things that art historians like are going on in that image. And by the way, if you ask Dali to give you Las Meninas, you get this kind of racist, kind of like folksy art thing on the top left here. Now, what do we get if we asked CLIP regarding to the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York for Las Meninas? And just to make this clear, the painting is not in the MoMA collection, right? It's in the Prado in Madrid, so the MoMA doesn't have it. But if you ask CLIP to find the visually closest thing in the collection of the MoMA, you get these two images, for instance. On the left, Richard Hamilton's Picasso's Meninas. And here the similarity is obvious because the composition is obviously a take on Las Meninas, right? If I go back, you can see it's almost exactly the same. But of course, stylistically, it's very, very different. So this is maybe, the reasons why this is selected by CLIP are kind of obvious. But for the right, which is Robert Desnos' La Dame Guinée from 1948, you can see that the similarity here is semantic, right? It's that there exists a gaze relation between an image and a person. Also, the person is looking, I think, through a window, through a shop window, at a painting. Another person is looking at the person looking at the painting. So the same kind of things that are going on in Las Meninas are going on in this image. Sorry, my iPad locked me out. Now, let me backtrack a little bit at this point. I'm not suggesting that one model, for instance, CLIP, is better than the other, for instance, DALL-E, that one model is more interpretable than the other, or that either model's representational structure is better aligned with our own human ways of looking at the world. In fact, I would argue actually that foundation models are so inaccessible at the moment, right? They're hidden behind APIs, they're commercialized, that any evaluation of these models, including the one that I'm doing right now, we have to take with a grain of salt. We really can't say much about these things. So this definitely stays superficial in a way. What I am suggesting, though, is that if we are looking for what remains of the human way of relating to the world in large-scale machine learning models, the context of inquiry matters a big deal. So in the case of DALL-E and CLIP, that means that the questions that fields like art history and visual studies ask become relevant technically. they inform not a high-level hermeneutical analysis, but a technical close reading of machine learning models. In other words, not unlike in Benjamin, it matters from where we look at the past. And the past in this case is the training data solidified in a model like CLIP or a model like DALI. But much unlike in Benjamin, while we can get a better look at this past data if we juxtapose it with present data, for instance right here, in the form of another image collection, another image corpus, we can never reclaim it for the present. We can never render it into history. Because in foundation models, or at least in the image models that I am researching, the past is irreversibly marked as the past. And this has to do, among other things, with the entanglement of form and content in these models. An example of this entanglement is the inability of models like DALI, and this is also true for other models that are out there, like Stable Diffusion, which are also very good. Their inability to generate color photos of fascism, that would be the prompt here. Because fascism is eternally marked as history. And even if you add keywords like 2020, that wouldn't help. And you can see actually, and this is the best that I could do, you can see how hard the models are trying, right, to make this into actual color photos. But they always kind of revert to a colorized aesthetics or an actual black and white photo. In the most literal understanding of the famous idea that history doesn't repeat itself for DALI and related image models and CLIP, even if it would be helpful to understand contemporary tendencies towards autocracy as the return of or a new form of fascism, this juxtaposition can simply not exist. In other words, the past for foundation models becomes history through specific forms of mediatization that are strongly and irreversibly entangled with specific historical periods. The recent past is literally black and white, and the distant past is actually made of marble. Now, let me again backtrack a little bit here. I'm not suggesting that these issues cannot possibly be solved technically, so machine learning people are very good at finding quick technical fixes for these kinds of things, especially for issues of entanglement, right? So this was an issue before in other generations of models, and they kind of have been solved. But this does not take away from the insight, I think, that history for machine learning systems is a hard problem, that things can be temporally so far removed from each other that they absolutely do not look the same, but at the same time be connected in a way such that it almost does look like history repeats itself, is something that cannot be taught to machines that rely on an understanding of similarity that is exclusively one of spatial distance. For instance, if we ask DALI 2 for the famous Laocoon and his sons, which is the famous marble statue that Winkelmann and other art historians wrote about, so a work that has defined art history forever, you either get a bunch of cats on the upper right here, so DALI has never heard of Laocoon, apparently, or if you give it an approximate date, you get a serene, kind of updated version that shows no trace of the very agony that is so essential to the work and its art historical analysis. The happy Laocoon family here, as if out of a company brochure, demonstrates how historicism and presentism peacefully coexist in models like DALI and CLIP. Another final example, the prompt Tankman, 1989, which references the famous photograph from the Chinese Tiananmen protest and subsequent massacre, produces an image of a soldier proudly looking at a tank rather than a scene of radical civil disobedience. Nothing has changed in terms of what is in the image, but everything has changed in terms of its role as a historical object. And I think given that as a medium itself, CLIP will, and already does, I think, structure much of our digital experience as a means of search, image retrieval, and recommendation, this, at the same time, presentist and historicist concept of history then becomes politically relevant. CLIP's understanding of history in a few years will necessarily impact our own interpretation of the past. I would thus like to end with a plea, so to speak, for more model specificity and context specificity in critical AI studies, media studies, and related disciplines. While we might not need a field called CLIP studies, yet we are, I think, at an inflection point where specific and thus historical critiques of specific and thus historical models might tell us more about our place within an ever-growing ecosystem of technical concreteness than general critiques of artificial intelligence as a technology. And an important part of this is the toolbox that we as humanists, as humanities scholars, already have at our disposal, which brings me to my last example, which is the title image for my talk. So as you might know, DALL-E is content restricted. There's restrictions. You can't use certain words, right? You can't generate pornography. You can't generate racist images. And also, it turns out, fascism is also a banned word. But you can still convince DALL-E to produce this image here on the right, a color photo of, which is again not a color photo because of the things I talked about before, a color photo of a fascist parade, if you intentionally misspell fascist here. So if you leave out the S that is necessary to make the correct spelling, right, you get what you want, or you get what you ask for. Language about language, the very core of humanist research, leads us beyond the linguistic and visual limitations of contemporary artificial intelligence systems. And I think this is where kind of like our next steps, or the next steps in our research have to necessarily start. Thank you so much for your attention.
Hello. Thank you for this full-minute start. Maybe you can just stay with us for a second, maybe for a few questions, if anyone has one. As long as you think about a question, and Maren, you have a microphone. I really like the point you're in the finish of your presentation. I think there's several words for that already. Hannes Bajor called it promptology.
Promptology,
yeah. From like the prompt you're putting into the machine and how you learn to.
Prompt engineering too.
Yeah. Prompt engineering. Okay, there's prompt engineering.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. And I really like the way thinking about how we have to understand the mechanics of the machine to actually get out of it what we need it to do. So this is a very interesting perspective of the structures in our mind, like how it changes the way we communicate. But that's just my what I wanted to add. There's a question right here by Geoff.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed the talk. With reference to Benjamin and on the concept of history, I'm wondering whether you've thought also about the idea of the dialectical image, this conception of the image at a standstill, images that are ready to explode in a revolutionary way, and whether that has any, throws any light upon the way that images work within these kind of systems, that they have this sort of dynamic quality.
Yeah, that's a great point, and of course that's a great reference that I've thought about. Let me kind of like sidetrack your question a little bit, and say one thing about Benjamin in this talk. Something that Sibylle Kremer said yesterday, I think is very important, which is that I'm not really sure, she wasn't really sure, and I think we all shouldn't be really sure if the theoretical frameworks that we have at our disposal still suffice to describe the phenomena, describe phenomena like DALL-E and other things. So is this really still a question of visual studies in that sense, or does it require a completely new hybrid discipline or hybrid approach, or half theoretical, half practical, half dialectical critique, half engineering approach? So I guess in a sense, these images, and especially the generated ones, right, they lend themselves so much to just going back to Benjamin, which is what I'm doing here, obviously, or going back to, I don't know, Mitchell or whoever, right, to talk about them. But maybe that's not enough, actually. Maybe we should look in a different direction to see what other disciplines have to say and maybe find new forms of critique. I'm aware that I really sidetracked your question there. I think that's a great reference, but yeah, I think we really need to deeply think about the frameworks that we use to approach this in the first place.
All right. Any other questions? Did Fabian already tell you everything you need to know? Conference is done.
That's a bad sign.
Okay. Thank you very much, Fabian, for your presentation.